Hi everyone. I wanted to check in real quick and do a chat, a very brief chat, on the most recent book that I finished. It is called The Penelopiad by Margaret Atwood. The Penelopiad. So, there. There's the cover. Kind of Art Deco. Um, this was published as part of I think it's called the Canongate Myth series. From what I remember reading online, and this could be wrong, was that this Canadian publisher was publishing some retelling of myths, and by famous writers, and so Margaret Atwood was approached to write on or I guess she chose to write on the Odyssey, by Homer, the ancient Greek story myth, and she decided to do this sort of retelling. Well, I think it's probably wrong to call it a retelling of the Odyssey, but what it is it's sort of the period of time of the Odyssey as told from the perspective of Penelope, who is the wife of Odysseus, from the Odyssey. So that's ultimately what it's about, basically, is just sort of her experience. So if you don't know the story of the Odyssey, I know it a bit, but not that well. But I knew it well enough to kind of to gather what's going on in the book. I think probably, though, if you don't know the Odyssey, it would be good to read at least a summary of the Odyssey before reading this book, because it's not always, the backstory is not always explained, so you don't always know the context for this character. But if you don't know, just to set it up, I guess, so her husband, Penelope's cousin, was Helen of Troy. Well, Helen. And then, the story of Helen of Troy. Helen gets abducted and sent to Troy, and then it starts the Trojan War. And so her husband, Odysseus, ultimately lives in kind of a distant kingdom, I guess, Ithaca, and he marries her, and while her cousin Helen gets married to Menelaus, and then ultimately does get abducted and taken to Troy, like I mentioned. But the war starts, and so Odysseus goes to the Trojan War, and then after the Trojan War is over, that alone takes 10 years. And then when that's over, he goes on this sort of journey, this Odyssey, which, that word in English comes from his name and from this book, the Odyssey, which is sort of this sort of roundabout journey, which also takes 10 years. So he's gone away from home quite a long time, and Penelope doesn't know anything about him. She doesn't know, I think she knew he was alive during the Trojan War, I think, but then, during this Odyssey he's on, this journey he's on afterwards, where he meets all sorts of adventures and whatnot, and takes him a long time to get home, in other words. But during this time, she doesn't know, sort of his well-being. She ultimately, though, as time goes on, everyone in Greece kind of assumes he's dead. Her husband is dead, and so she gets these suitors that come for her to marry her, and they hang around, and because of the hospitality rules of the time, she has to feed them and whatnot. And there's quite a lot of them. There's over 100 of them. I think they're all quite younger than her, but she has to sort of play host to them, and she puts them off because she doesn't want to marry any of them. And so she has this technique she weaves. She says she can't pick one of them and get remarried until she finishes this shroud and that she's weaving. And so what she does is she weaves on it during the day, and then at night she actually unweaves it, she and her maids. So this story is told, speaking of her maids, the story is told sort of in this, sort of as if, well, Penelope in part of the story is actually in the underworld, so it's our time, our current time, and she's speaking, over the course of these centuries that have passed since all these things happened. And so it's told from this sort of perspective, but then as interspersed in the chapters is the tale sort of from the perspective of these these maidens that helped her, to her servant girls who helped her to unweave the shroud at night. They ultimately, when Odysseus did return, he and his son Telemachus actually hung the maids. So they're called the 12 hanged maids. I think Odysseus accused them of being like collaborating with the suitors, and so had them all hung with ropes. And so it's quite brutal, actually. So their part of the story is told as kind of like this background chorus, and it's kind of humorous the way it's done, because the handmaids, the maidens. I'll talk about The Handmaid's Tale in a minute with Margaret Atwood. But back to the maids from this story. It's told from sort of like, sometimes it's like a little play, sometimes it's like a little song and dance, a little chorus. It sort of has this humorous bent to it, but it's very macabre, because ultimately they're sort of lampooning their own fate, which was to be hung. So I think taking away from the book, what I took away from the book really was the idea, the role of women in. I think Margaret Atwood, did a good job in this sort of lighthearted and brief, sort of almost a little novelette. I think it's like 200 pages of really highlighting, the role of women in ancient Greek mythology and in ancient Greek stories like the Odyssey and the Iliad. And it was done in sort of this now kind of on the cover, one of the reviewers, that's the blurb is on the cover of the book, says that this book is part Dorothy Parker and part Desperate Housewives, because it really kind of reads this really kind of light way. Penelope's sort of lamenting her status and her condition. Of course, she's powerless to change any of this in the given social rules in which she lived. So she has to marry Odysseus. She has no power within the household. His mother-in-law has the power. Her son Telemachus eventually grows up, without his father there, and even he once he gets a little old, he becomes a teenager, and then he sort of asserts his patriarchal male role, which is to even dominate his mother. And then the maidens also, they were powerless to stop their fate. Then when Odysseus came home and just ordered them hung, then they just were hung. This story, it was so different. I had just read, and you might have seen the video, the book I read immediately prior to this was The Song of Achilles, which was it wasn't a retelling of the Iliad, but it took place during the events of the Iliad, and it was told from the perspective of Patroclus and Achilles. And so I chose this book in particular because it took place during the Odyssey and was told from the perspective of Penelope. The books were really quite different. Patroclus and Achilles, I really felt like that book, The Song of Achilles, really updated their relationship and really put their relationship, while keeping it in the era of the Iliad. It presented it to us as 21st century people in sort of in a framework that's really relevant to us. So whether or not the Penelopiad did that or not, I'm not real sure. I didn't connect with it the same way that I did with Song of Achilles, but I do get the fact of, this idea of just sort of highlighting really briefly. It wasn't, it did not go into depth with character building, for example, for Penelope. We don't know a lot about her inner world, really. It was really just kind of a relatively short sort of overview of what she was up to during the time that Odysseus was away, and also really highlighting the culture that she lived in, the patriarchal kind of male-dominated culture that she was in. And then also, another thing about these 12 12 Hanged Maids is that I was not aware of them. Even though I've heard of the Odyssey on and on, over time, the Cyclops and the Sirens and the different aspects of different stories that take place during the Odyssey. This Hanged Maids, I hadn't ever really thought about, and I think that's really the importance of works like this that really point out something like this. And it's like, really, Odysseus, this Greek ideal. Well, we don't think of him as an ideal like we do Achilles, but we do think of him as this Greek, figure. I think it does us good, did me good actually to stop for a minute and say, wait, Odysseus actually came home and had these 12 girls hung, and for not real clear reasons and not real valid reasons from what I could tell. So I think that was kind of the best part of the book that I took away. Otherwise, it wasn't. I think I was kind of going into it expecting it to be more like the Song of Achilles, meaning more of a character study of Penelope within that. A fictionalized, of course. Obviously, she's a fictional character, probably, but. Within the context of the Odyssey, and it was really a little lighter than that, and that's fine too. It was very quick to read, and I'm certainly not sorry I did and added it to the experience right after the Song of Achilles. I think that was fine. So glad I picked it up. I think I'll stop with that. My next book chat should be coming up real soon. I have one more book going on about the Iliad and Odyssey because I've just been on a roll with this, and this is a nonfiction work, so I should be finished with that soon, so stay tuned. Take care. Bye.